Guess what? I think there's an aggravating factor that could significantly increase Sunny Balwani's potential sentence. And I'll get to that, but before I get there, I want to share with you a statement issued by the FDA and the U.S. Postal Inspector regarding the verdict, what they said about the verdict, and I'm also going to answer a bunch of your questions. So thank you to all of those of you who have submitted questions and comments. So we're going to talk about restitution. We're going to talk about victims' right. Would I have put Sunny Balwani on the stand? And was there or could there have been a plea deal? I mean, what other options did Sunny Balwani have other than going to trial? Okay, so thank you to all of those of you who have subscribed to my channel and helping me grow this community of analyzers. And welcome to all of those of you new subscribers. Thank you for joining us. And please do share these videos, hit that like button, hit the bell notification. Please do leave a comment or question. I want to know what your analysis is because this video is simply my opinion, my analysis, and it's for education and information purposes. What do you think that aggravating factor is? What do you think? All right, so let's look at what the FDA said. The FDA was involved in investigating too in the Sunny Balwani and Elizabeth Holmes case, in the Theranos case. So the FDA Assistant Commissioner said the following: medical product fraud jeopardizes patient health. This defendant, Sunny Balwani, joins his partner in being found guilty of fraud related to diagnostic tests. The FDA will vigilantly investigate and bring to justice individuals and companies responsible for putting the public health at risk. The U.S. Postal Acting Inspector said, I want to thank the FBI, the FDA Office of Criminal Investigations, and the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of California for their extraordinary teamwork supporting this verdict. Postal inspectors have been investigating snake oil and investment fraud schemes for more than 100 years, and we remain committed to uncovering criminal frauds with these partners. And if you want to see what the U.S. Attorney's Office, the Department of Justice, what they said, I went over it in the prior video, so take a look at the Sunny Balwani possible sentence video. All right, so Sunny Balwani remains free on bond, and if you remember, the judge increased his bond from $500,000, which is what it is for Elizabeth Holmes. For Sunny Balwani, it's now $750,000 secured bond by cash or property. All right, so what's the next step that's going to happen? Well, the defense has an opportunity to file post-trial or post-verdict motions. A motion for a new verdict, potentially, a motion for a acquittal of a motion for judgment of acquittal, which is the motion that Elizabeth Holmes has already filed, and other motions that the defense could potentially file challenging the verdict. You know, insufficient evidence, there was a problem with the indictment, any of those kind of issues. But when is that motion due? These motions are due within 14 days of the verdict. So if I did my math right, that means the defense has to file any motions by July 21st, which happens to be the same day that the hearing is set for Elizabeth Holmes' motion for judgment of acquittal. Basically saying to the judge, the evidence is insufficient. It doesn't support the verdicts found in the Holmes case. So we'll have to see what, if any, motions the Balwani defense files. All right, so let me get to your questions, and they were quite interesting, and your comments. So shout out to Lynn B. Thank you for subscribing to my channel. She said the following: Michele, I know you have repeatedly said that everyone is entitled to a fair trial. Yes, they are. That being said, I think Sunny Balwani's defense failed him miserably and damaged theirs and Sunny Balwani's credibility from day one of the trial. Claiming that Sunny Balwani was a duped investor was just flat out false. The jury came to the same conclusion. He was the CEO, actually he was the COO. He ran the labs, and Sunny was an integral part of setting up the Walgreens debacle. Sunny's own texts, like his texts that I pointed out in the last video, all been my decisions too. I'm responsible for the decisions too. That text, I think, was probably potentially pretty incriminating for Balwani. And if you want to take a look at those texts that I think were pretty damaging, you can look at the videos I did on the text between Holmes and Sunny Balwani. So she also said it made the defense team look foolish and destroyed their credibility, and the jury got it right. Well, this case, my response, and again, I'm not advocating for either side here, I'm just analyzing. Based on the evidence, it was a tough case for the defense. All those texts between Sunny letting Elizabeth know about what was going on in the lab, all the, when they found out that the Walgreens had found out that they turned off the machine, all those texts were quite incriminating. The fact that Sunny was at the lab all the time, overseeing the lab, I think the jury found that to be very incriminating towards Balwani. And again, we don't know what the jury says because unless they talk to us, we don't, they don't have to speak, so it's a civic duty that it is protected. So she asked whether or not there could have been a plea deal. Let's see. I think a plea deal was the responsible approach for counsel to take. Well, there may not have been a plea deal offered by the prosecution. The defense is not entitled to a plea deal. Okay? The prosecution, and sometimes they will offer to negotiate the plea. For instance, saying the defense could plead to 6 of the counts and the government will dismiss 6. They could make those kind of offers, but there may not have been any negotiation, especially after the Elizabeth Holmes verdict came in. I don't know. You have to ask the government that question. Okay, so Alf92, thank you for subscribing and your question. Will the sentencing people, that would be the judge, will the sentencing people just throw the book at Sunny and go easy on Elizabeth Holmes? I don't think so. I think based on the sentencing guidelines and based on the videos I've done, you can look at the calculating Elizabeth Holmes sentence videos. I did 4 of them relating to how the judge potentially could calculate the sentence based on the United States federal sentencing guidelines, which are advisory, not mandatory. And also, I took a look at what the judge has done as far as sentencing in prior cases. So, will the judge throw the book at Sunny Balwani or Elizabeth Holmes? I mean, I don't think either of them are going to get a slap on the hand. Sunny was convicted of all 12 counts, so that takes him down, and I'll show you the sentencing guideline. Takes him down quite a bit, and I'll also tell you about the aggravating factor. The one factor that I think is really going to be potentially harmful towards the sentence for Sunny Balwani. Okay, so Catherine Hatter, and thank you for your comment as well. She may be a new subscriber. I don't know. If you haven't subscribed, Catherine, please do subscribe. And by the way, please do subscribe, hit that like button, and share these videos. All right, so Catherine mentioned there's another case called Outcome Health Incorporated, where several of the executives and employees have been charged with wire fraud, bank fraud, and mail fraud relating to a fraudulent scheme regarding advertising, point of contact advertising, and getting investors to invest. I think it was approximately $1 billion. So that case is coming up, and that's going to take place in Chicago. So I think she's following the Sunny Balwani and the Holmes case to see what the potential outcome could be in the Outcome Health case. All right, so another subscriber, San, said, I predict Elizabeth gets 10 years out of 8 for good behavior while in prison. Sunny will get 12 years and get 9. He'll serve 9 for good behavior. And if he would have pled, he would have gotten 5 years and got out in 4. Well, we don't know that. I don't think he would have gotten 5 years. But, in federal court, in federal sentencing, if I'm correct about this, they generally serve 85% of their sentence. Okay, so I will talk about this in a further video as we get closer to sentencing. Okay, so Doug Kelly said, I'm curious what this defense cost Sunny, and would it be just as expensive for an appeal? Typically, I don't know what the fee agreement is. You'll have to ask the defense. But appeals take longer, and so they typically are much more expensive. Appeals could take 1 to 2 years if Sunny or Elizabeth Holmes appeals either of their verdicts. Depending on what the backlog is or the caseload, it could take 1 to 2 years before the appeal is final. It could even be longer than that. That's assuming they file an appeal. And I bet they probably both will file an appeal of their verdicts. Okay, so Fong Fan said, who did conspire with Elizabeth if Elizabeth only got convicted of 1 count, where he got convicted of both? Well, they're separate juries, right? So the judge is going to be looking at the evidence on each one of the trials to determine what the sentence is for each defendant, okay? So in the Balwani case, that jury found that Sunny Balwani conspired with Elizabeth Holmes on both of those counts, defrauding investors and defrauding patients. Elizabeth Holmes was only found of conspiring with Balwani regarding defrauding investors. She was not convicted of conspiring to defraud patients, and she was not convicted on any of the patient counts. Okay, so another question I got was, Alex said, wow, significantly more time than Elizabeth Holmes. Yes, because he was convicted of all 12 counts. And the amount of loss. Remember what I talked about in the last video? Because he was convicted on all 6 of the investor counts, that's about 155 million in defrauding, the amount of defrauding, the amount of loss. Where Elizabeth Holmes was only convicted on 3 investor counts, which was approximately 144 million. So Sunny Balwani is looking at significantly more time, okay, because of the amount of loss and because I think of some of these aggregating factors. All right, so I've been waiting for this moment for a long time, he said. Good work, amazing coverage on both cases. Thank you. Thank you, Alex. Let's see. Jackie says, why is this a different jury than Elizabeth Holmes? Well, their cases were tried separately, different juries. The juries found the evidence. They looked at the evidence. The evidence was different in each case, but their outcomes were different. I thought Elizabeth Holmes was much more culpable. Yeah, I think many people would agree with you on that. But she was tried by a jury of her peers, and they determined that she was guilty of 4 counts, where another jury decided that Sunny Balwani was guilty of all 12 counts. So, over 40 reacts, a subscriber. Thank you for subscribing. Can judge consider Balwani's guilty counts in determining Holmes' sentence? Well, the judge is going to be looking at the evidence in the Sunny Balwani trial and the verdict in the Sunny Balwani trial. Let's see. Thanks so much. And let's see. J. Randy Pinnock said, I think Elizabeth Holmes is going to get off easy considering the big money involved. I don't. They both hung on for a year or two too long. Well, I think the big money, meaning the amount of loss, is what's going to sink Elizabeth Holmes, potentially in her sentence, right? That's what exposes her, because the more money that's defrauded, the more sentence, the more prison time you're looking at. And I'll show you that in a second. Okay, so last question here was from Hugo. Thank you, Hugo, for your question. Will restitution be ordered for both of them? Yes. Restitution will be ordered for both of them as to each of these counts, right? So in Elizabeth Holmes, she was convicted of those 3 counts regarding investors, which is 144 million. So she's potentially looking at 144 million in restitution. Again, this is up to the judge to determine what's appropriate. Sunny Balwani was convicted of all 6 counts of the investor, which is 155 million. So he could potentially be ordered to pay restitution in that amount. Again, that's up to the judge. It's his discretion. Okay, so here's the question. In your opinion, did Balwani not testifying hurt him? Well, okay, so how do we decide whether or not a defendant takes a stand? So, number 1, the decision as to whether or not our client, the defendant, takes a stand, that's up to them. So, number 1, it's up to the defendant to decide whether or not he or she takes a stand. That's their call to make. We can give advice, but what would I have done? Well, it depends on, I don't know Sunny Balwani. It depends on how he comes across, right? How he would testify, how he would respond to cross-examination. And more importantly, what's the evidence that could be used against him in cross-examination? And I think there was significantly a lot of incriminating evidence. Those text messages, I mean, the prosecution could have done a very damaging cross-examination of Sunny Balwani. So, it's a strategy as to whether or not you put your client on the stand. Again, it's up to them. And it really depends on the amount of evidence and what kind of evidence and what the prosecution could do in cross-examination. So I think that's probably what deterred Sunny Balwani from taking the stand. I don't know. You let me know. What do you think? Okay, so along the lines of restitution, the victims in federal court, they have a right to be heard in sentencing. In other words, the judge can consider what the victims think about this verdict and think about their experience with Elizabeth Holmes and Sunny Balwani in determining the appropriate amount of restitution, whether or not they want restitution. So they have a right to be heard at the hearing. They can appear at the hearing, or they could have one of their representatives. So all of those 6 investors, Dan Mosley, Alan Eisenman, Brian Grossman, Chris Lucas, somebody from the DeVos family, possibly Lisa Peterson, etc. All of those potential witnesses, they can testify and they can give input towards the sentencing for Sunny Balwani. Okay, so let me get to the aggravating factor that I think in looking at, and I'm recalculating my assessment of what the potential sentence for Sunny Balwani could be. And so I looked at, for the aggravating factors. And if you want to take a look at the video I did on 4 ways the judge could increase Elizabeth Holmes' sentence, you can take a look at that because those same factors could apply to Sunny Balwani. And what's the one factor that I think is going to be particularly difficult for Sunny Balwani? Guess what? It's that missing database. You know how the defense was trying to get it into trial, to talk about what happened with the missing database? Well, there's testimony that came out that Sunny had the code regarding the database. Sunny was the one that, I think, if I'm correct about this, put the database together. Well, the database was provided to the prosecution, but they weren't provided with the code. Now, whether or not that could be argued to be this aggravating factor called obstructing justice, and if the judge or if the prosecution asks for that, and if the judge considers that, that would increase Sunny Balwani's sentence. Okay, so the 4 factors are: number 1, was he a manager, a supervisor, a leader? If he was, that increases by 3 steps. Another aggravating factor was let me look at my notes here. Did he abuse his trust regarding taking in the investor money? If he did, that increases his steps by 2. Did he obstruct justice by the missing database or having anything to do with the database? That's another 2. So if you add those up, that's 3 plus 2 plus 2, that's 7 additional steps. So let's take a look. Let's recalculate the potential sentence here for Sunny Balwani. And also this could apply to Elizabeth Holmes, by the way. So let me show you here. This is the sentencing table that I've gone over with you in the prior video I did on the possible sentence for Sunny Balwani. In those 4 videos I did on calculating the sentence for Elizabeth Holmes, which I encourage you to take a look at. Okay, so we started at level 7 for fraud, okay, for both of them, level 7. So that's up to 6 months, but we have to take into consideration the amount of money that was defrauded. Okay, so we're going to go down the scale here because for Sunny Balwani, he was convicted of all 6 counts, so that's $155 million. So that you add 26 steps. So that takes him to a 7 plus 26 is 33. So he's looking at a minimum 135 to 168 months. But because of the aggravating factors, and in particular that obstruction of justice factor, if they argue that missing database was an obstruction, or his role as a leader or manager, or abuse of trust by taking in investor money, you can add 7 steps. So that takes them down to 292 months to 365 months. Okay, where Elizabeth Holmes starts at 31 because she was only convicted on those 3 investor counts. So she starts at 108 months. But if you add those 7 aggravating factors, she's looking at 235 to 293 months. So none of this is a slap on the wrist. And again, the federal sentencing guidelines, that table I just showed you, that's advisory for the judge. But in my opinion, this judge does follow the sentencing guidelines. He does consider those ranges. And it looks like he gives about a 30% less sentence relating to those sentences ranges. So Sunny Balwani, he's looking at anywhere from level 33 to 40, where Elizabeth Holmes is 31, level 31 to 38. So, that's far more than 94 months that I originally thought. So anyway, you can take a look. You can do your own calculation. So I want to say thank you to all of you who have subscribed. Please do support my work by subscribing. Hit that like button, hit the bell notification, share these videos, and do leave a comment. What's your analysis? So thank you so much for watching.